Even almost to the end.
Don't get up. Don't get up. How are you feeling today?
Do you know? Not too bad.
Okay, that's better than yesterday.
Maybe.
Maybe. Okay, it'll get better than yesterday.
It's now I am like zebra.
Yeah.
White, black, white, black. What? Start was okay. I gave lesson.
Good. Good.
When I give lesson, I feel much better. And right now, with this enthusiasm.
Okay.
We don't miss a beat. Oh, good. That's true.
Start whenever you're ready.
Okay, ready?
Yeah?
Good morning. Before we begin, just want to make a few announcements. There's a weekly class on the Torah portion that used to be Monday nights. It was changed to Monday at 3:30 at the lot. We do it at the Federation Housing. So if anyone, it's also on Zoom. That's 3:30 Mondays. The next 3 weeks, as we prepare for Passover, the classes will be, the next week will be the Jewish obsession with the Exodus. The next class will be the other side of the Seder, going into depth into the Seder. And the last week before Passover, the class will be on the practical Passover, focusing on the practical aspects of Passover. So those are the 3 following classes. These are all on Sundays at 11 a.m., God willing. Addenda week. That means we're going to talk, at least at the beginning, about a few things that we touched on, but we didn't quite finish. So we'll try to cover those areas today. We spoke about reincarnation, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But reincarnation is about how a soul that does not fulfill its mission while it's here the first time, assuming that it's a significant deficit, the soul will have to come down again to make up for what it missed. And that is the reason for reincarnation. Reincarnation is not for the soul to go into a more perfect body, but to fulfill its mission that it missed in the first time it was here. So the idea of reincarnation is that when a person is born, that soul enters the body and animates that person. Now, that soul of the first time it was here doesn't need to be perfected in every respect. We assume that everyone does some good in this world, and to the extent that they fulfill their mission in one particular area, that part of the soul does not need rectification, does not need rehabilitation, does not need to be returned to this world to perfect what it missed, because it did the right things. I divided up the mission of a person into 3 categories, and there are subcategories, but these are the 3 major categories: the intellectual, the emotional, and the practical. In Judaism, there are aspects of Judaism that focus on the mind. We're supposed to know that there is one God. We're supposed to know the teachings of the Torah. So that focuses on the mind. And there are some people who excel in that, or some people who fail in that regard. Then there is the emotional aspect of Judaism, the love that we have to feel for God, for one another. The emotional aspects of Judaism are a separate category. although all categories are interconnected and intertwined. And the third category relates to the practical, doing good, giving charity, helping someone, putting on tefillin, wearing tzitzis, and lighting candles, and so on and so forth. So if a person, let's say, just for the sake of clarity, did not do what they had to do in terms of their intellectual side, so that part of the soul is missing something and has to come back down again. But the part that involves the emotions and the practical, assuming that that person was good in those areas, doesn't need to come back into this world. Why come back again? And coming back again, there's a risk involved. The risk involved is that you could mess up, that you didn't mess up the first time around. Why give a person another chance to mess up? So that part of the soul goes straight into Gan Eden, into paradise. Now, they might have some imperfections for which Gehenna, the Jewish version of hell, is there to purify the person. They don't have to come back down again because they essentially fulfilled their mission in that area. But then there's an area in which they didn't fulfill their mission. That part of the soul comes back down again. It doesn't mean, let's say, if they were missing in the intellectual sphere and they have to come down again, all they have is intellect, no emotion, and no practical things. They have to do all of those things, and their soul, even though it's a breakaway from the original soul, has a full complement of all of its faculties. Just like the original soul was Adam's soul, and from Adam's soul broke into specific souls. So every one of our souls, no matter how broken down it may be from the original, has a full complement of all of its faculties. So some faculties don't need to come down again, and some do have to come down again. That was the idea that we spoke about in the past. But now there's another concept in teachings of Jewish mysticism called Ibur. The Hebrew word for reincarnation is Gilgul. Gilgul comes from a root that means like circle. It reoccurs. It recycled. Yes, we believe in recycling. The souls have to be recycled sometimes. But then there's Ibur, which literally means pregnancy. What that means, if you can read on page 1, is that the soul that animates the person is augmented by another soul. In other words, you have your soul, and another soul, or part of another soul, enters into you at some point in your life. Now, why would that happen? Why would there be a need for that? One reason would be if a person has a limited spiritual state of mind. Their spiritual levels are limited. They have a certain potential, and they can't go beyond their potential. And the person wants to grow to a higher level. Sometimes through prayer, you could allow a soul of another person, of a very righteous person, enter into you that gives you the ability, that gives you a boost, that you're able to reach a higher spiritual level. Sometimes a person is weak in their spirituality and they need to have a boost, and that soul can come into them and stay with them for as long as they need it, and that gives them the ability to grow. And that's maybe sometimes you can feel it yourself. Sometimes in life you get a second wind, and all of a sudden you feel motivated and inspired, and you don't know where did that come from. It may come from the soul that you have, that you didn't realize its potential, that could be, but it also can be from another soul that enters into you and gives you a boost. Now sometimes the soul that comes into you, soul itself is looking for rectification. And let me share with you 2 stories. It's one story within a story. The Rabbi was once giving a long discourse on a passage in the Talmud. The story in the Talmud is during the Greek occupation of Israel, for which we have the holiday of Hanukkah, when we got rid of their control. While the Greeks were still in control, the Talmud tells a story of a certain woman. Her name was Miriam, the daughter of Bilgah. This woman came from a priestly family, from a very noble family, priestly family, but she rebelled against her own people. She married a Greek official and rebelled against the Jews. And she came into the temple at one point, the holy temple that was occupied by the Greeks and defiled by them. And she went over to the altar. The altar was the place upon which they would offer sacrifices. And she took her shoe and she banged it on the altar and she said, "Lukus, lukus." That's Greek for wolf. The altar is sometimes referred to as the wolf that devours the meat. You devoured all this meat of the Jewish people and you do nothing for them. And this was looked upon as a sacrilegious experience, that she had the chutzpah to go into the temple and bang with her shoe. Reminds me of Khrushchev. Some of you can remember. Well, he got the idea from Miriam. Didn't give credit to her. So she banged on this altar disrespectfully and rebelliously, attacking the altar, that which was holy for the Jewish people. And because of that, her family of priests were penalized in the temple, that they would take certain positions were taken away from them. We're not going to go into that part of it. So the Rebbe gave a talk, a very long talk. He defended Miriam. The Rebbe defended her and saying, look, even the rebel, she's complaining to God why he doesn't protect his people. So even the worst Jew had this feeling of closeness to her people, even as she's rebelling against God, rebelling against the temple, rebelling against her own people. And the Rebbe emphasized the good in her. And the Rebbe got a lot of criticism for that. People complained, why are you trying to defend this horrible woman, this rebel, and trying to find some good in her? And the Rebbe gave a long discourse in defending the fact that we have to look for the good in everyone. But then the Rebbe told a story. This is a little eerie. Told a story about his ancestor, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, where there was a person who came to him and he was possessed. People would call this a dibuk, where you're possessed by having some other soul come into you, which is what we're talking about over here. But this soul apparently was not there to give you more spirituality. This soul was in pain and looked for someone to help it. So this person came to the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, and the Chabad Rebbe told a story. This is the story goes back to biblical times during the first temple. There was a prophet called Zechariah. There were two prophets with that name, but this is the earlier one. And he prophesied many decades before the temple's destruction that the temple will be destroyed if the people don't repent. And they murdered him. In fact, his blood starts seething until the time when the temple was destroyed, and that's a separate story. The Babylonian general, Nuvazardan, was asking, why is this blood boiling? It was an unnatural thing. And the people wouldn't tell him, so he started murdering the priests by the thousands, until finally they told him that this is the prophet who predicted the destruction of the temple, and the people murdered him. So the Alter Rebbe explained, why did the people murder him? Because he was talking about the destruction of the temple. So what? I mean, he's a prophet. That's what he does. He prophesizes. He predicts the future. Because there's a principle in Judaism that a true prophet, if he doesn't utter the prophecy, it won't come true. It'll only come true if he actually verbalizes it. He actually vocalizes it. He says the words of the prophecy. So on one hand, if he doesn't say the words of the prophecy, it won't come true. But on the other hand, if he's a prophet, he's obligated to pronounce the prophetic message. He's not allowed to withhold it. But the people knew that principle, that if a prophet doesn't say the prophecy, it won't come true. So the people told him, don't say the prophecy. And he refused, and they murdered him. So the Alter Rebbe was defending the murderers in a certain sense because they didn't want the temple to be destroyed. And as soon as he said that, which he came to the defense of the murderer of this prophet, this dibuk, this possessed person, was healed. So the Rebbe was saying the same thing is true over here with this Miriam. Apparently, the Rebbe didn't spell it out, but if you read between the lines, the Rebbe was saying the soul of Miriam was wandering for thousands of years. How many thousands? It's probably 2,300, 2,400 years. Was wandering and could not come to peace because of what she did, the horrible things that she did to rebel against her people. And she was waiting, that soul was waiting for someone to say something good about her, to find the good in her. And that's when her soul was no longer in pain, no longer in turmoil. So that's another example of how a soul could become attached to another person because the soul is looking for rehabilitation.
Excuse me. Best soul go to paradise. Yes?
Yeah.
And they stay in paradise.
They could come.
Don't come back.
No, they could come back.
Stay in paradise.
No, they could come back. There are cases where they can come back.
They come back.
They could.
I think not best soul go to people. Best soul stay in paradise.
Not necessarily. Sometimes a soul comes back for another reason, to do something, to accomplish something that is needed. There's stories about that as well. There's a story that the Baal Shem Tov told a couple who were married many years and they had no children. So they came to the Baal Shem Tov to ask him for his blessing, and he wouldn't give the blessing. And in 1 year he gave the blessing, and they had a beautiful baby. And the baby reached the age of 2, the baby died. So they came to the Baal Shem Tov and complained, you gave us a blessing, but what kind of a blessing is that the baby died? So the Baal Shem Tov told them a story. It's a long story, I'm not going to repeat the whole story, but the story was of someone of a soul that there was, maybe I'll tell more details. There was a certain king who was childless, and his advisor, who was an anti-Semite, told him, the Jews are the ones who can get you a child. Jews can do everything. And even though you're childless, they will pray, God will grant their request. And he threatened the Jews that if they don't give him a child, that he's going to drive them out of the country or wherever it was. And this king was not destined to have a child. There was no soul for that child. So one soul that was in paradise volunteered to come down and to become the child of the king. This is a Jewish soul and agreed to come down as a non-Jew in the form of a child for this king and queen. And when the child grew up, he bumped into certain Jews and became inspired by them, and he converted to Judaism. I'm making a long story very short. He became inspired and he converted to Judaism. And when that soul returned to paradise, it was said that the soul was so holy that it made such a great sacrifice, in addition to being a righteous soul beforehand, but it had one stain, that it was raised as a little baby in the house of a pagan king. And the soul would have to come down again to be raised in the house of a righteous person, to rectify that it's 2 years that it was in the house of this pagan king and queen. And that's why the Baal Shem Tov says, you were not destined to have any children. But when that soul was looking for a place to come down again, you had the privilege that you were the parents of that holy soul, and for those 2 years. So that's an example of someone was already in paradise and was sent back down again. The Rebbe spoke, I mentioned this briefly in an earlier class, of the words of the Arizal, the great Kabbalist, that our generation, the Rebbe referred to it as our generation, which means the Rebbe's looking at our generation as the final generation of Jewish history before the Messianic age. That our generation is a reincarnation of the Jews who left Egypt in the Exodus. And the Rebbe emphasized over and over again, I heard this from the Rebbe dozens, if not hundreds of times, that the only reason the Jews were able to get out of slavery, out of Egypt, was in the merit of the women. If it was up to the men, we'd still be slaves in Egypt. It was the women were the ones, because of their faith, that's what got us out of Egypt. And this Talmud tells many stories. Stories were that the men gave up hope. And they decided, we're not going to have any more children. We're not going to live normal lives because there's no point in anything. They resigned themselves to their fate. They were depressed and gave up on everything. And the women were the ones who kept the men going. And they married and they reproduced. And that's what gave the Jewish people the strength to endure the exile. And ultimately, they had such faith that they would be redeemed. You know, when you read the story in the Torah about how when they crossed the sea, the men sang praise to God for the miracle. Then when it says how Miriam, Moses' sister, not the other Miriam, Moses' sister, when she sang, they sang with what's the name of that instrument? Tambourines, right, with tambourines. The men didn't bring along tambourines. The women brought along tambourines. When they left Egypt, they knew they're going to be praising God. They're going to be singing praise. So they took the tambourines along with them. The men did not have that faith and trust. So the exodus from Egypt who was responsible for it? It was the women who were responsible. Because of the righteous women, they didn't lose their faith. And it repeated itself many times in the desert. When the men were rebelling, the women were not part of it. When the men were rebelling with the golden calf, it's interesting how Aaron tells the people he's trying to delay and not be forced into creating an idol. So he says to them, take the jewelry of your wives and your children and give it to me, and I'll do something with it. And then the Torah says they took their own jewelry and gave it to Aaron. The women refused to participate. They knew there's something's not kosher over here, and they said, we're not going to be partners over here. But then when they had to build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the sanctuary, it says the women came before the men and give their jewelry. So when it came to doing something, some hanky-panky, they said, no, we're not sharing our jewelry. When it came to doing something positive and holy, they were the first to go. The women, when the men started crying, when they heard they're going to go into the promised land, and it was a terrible land, because the spies came back with a slanderous report, the men cried, and they were all punished that they would never live to see the promised land. The women did not cry. They didn't participate, not one woman. And this repeated itself in many, many instances, that when the Jews left Egypt, that generation, it was the women who were the ones responsible for the Exodus and for all the other good things that happened and avoided all the negative things. And that our generation, the Rebbe would emphasize over and over again, we are a reincarnation of that generation. We are here to complete what they started. And you have the Rebbe's address about this, one of his addresses on page 2, which you could read. Now, here's a question about reconciling resurrection with reincarnation. If we believe in reincarnation, it could be that soul was here a few times. But then, in the Messianic age, we believe in the 13th principle of faith, as espoused by Maimonides, that the dead will come back to life. So it could be that the soul inhabited 3 bodies or more. Which body will come back to life? So the answer given by the Arizal, the great Kabbalist, is that they'll all come back. Why? Because it's not really the same soul, as we explained before. It's the general soul that gets divided up into different parts, and each time the soul comes down is to deal with another part of its composition, another part of its existence. And therefore, that one soul that was here, let's say 3,000 years ago, and came down 3 more times, those are 3 different souls. They're all interconnected. They're all like siblings are connected, but each sibling is an independent being. The same thing, each soul comes into this world to deal with one aspect of the personality that was left unfulfilled. And therefore, each body will have its own part of the soul and will be resurrected. The only exception to that would be is if the same part of the soul has to come down more than once, because it messed up each time the same way. So you're dealing with a soul that these things together. In one of the earlier classes, we mentioned a letter that the Rabbi wrote to General Sharon, or Ariel Sharon, the hero of the Six-Day War, who later on became Prime Minister of Israel. Although it's interesting, the Rebbe, who came very close to him, told him not to go into politics. He should stay in the military, because when generals become politicians, they sometimes mess things up. But that's a separate subject for another time. So what happened after the Six-Day War, when he was heralded as a great hero and everything, tragedy befell, what's the word, befelled him?
Befell.
What?
Befell.
Befelled. It's past tense.
Just befell.
It befell? Okay, I'll take your word for it. What happened, his son was playing around somehow with a weapon, and the weapon discharged and he was killed by accident. And he was devastated. This was like after a few months after the greatest miracle of the Six-Day War, where millions of lives were saved, and tragically his own child was killed, and he couldn't find any consolation. And the Rebbe wrote him a letter, and he said that, and he carried that letter around with him for many years. He said that letter was the only thing that was able to console him. And the letter, the Rebbe emphasizes and focuses on the traditional text for comforting mourners. May the omnipresent God console you along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. So what is the reason for emphasizing that may God console you along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem? What's the point of comparing it to the other mourners? So the Rebbe explained three things. There are 3 points. Point number 1, when you suffer in life, the way you can get consolation and comfort is when your suffering is not in solitude, when you're mourning and grieving together with others. Everyone is crying with you, literally or figuratively. And that's why we emphasize that you lost a loved one. We all lost our loved ones, and not just our own personal, our own relatives, but every Jew is in mourning for the loss of the temple, of the Holy Temple. Even though it's close to 2,000 years, we're still remembering that temple and what we lost, because that temple was not just a building. Throughout history, many buildings were destroyed, and that's tragic, then a building has to be destroyed. But that building represented an era in which God's presence was felt amongst the people, and that gave the people spiritual support. And by losing that temple, we lost our spirituality, we lost our identity in many ways. So when we all are grieving and mourning, you're not grieving by yourself, you're grieving together with every Jew. Every Jew is now crying with you. Second point the Rebbe made, just like the temple, we believe will be rebuilt. When Mashiach comes, one of the first things that he will be doing is to rebuild the temple. And if you ask, well, the Arabs won't allow it. Well, if he's Mashiach, he's going to find a way of getting the Arabs to agree with it, one way or another. If he can't get them, he's not Mashiach. Then you know that you're dealing with some other person, not Mashiach. Mashiach is the one who's going to make it happen, and that's one of the proofs that he is the Mashiach, if he could make it happen. So just like the temple will be rebuilt, so too we believe that the body will come back to life at the period of the resurrection of the dead. So that's another form of consolation. And number 3, even now, where there is no temple, the temple does still exist in the spiritual sense. The temple is destroyed physically, but not spiritually, because you can't destroy the spiritual aspect of the temple. And because of that, you should get consolation, because you know also that the soul of your loved one is still here, has not been destroyed. It can't be destroyed. And now we go to the Kaddish. Kaddish is not a prayer for the dead. There's no mention of the dead or your loved one in Kaddish. So the question is, what exactly is Kaddish and what's the purpose for saying Kaddish? So first, we have to know that Kaddish exists in many forms, and not all the forms are for mourners. You have the half Kaddish in the prayer services, where you use it as a transitional theme following minor portions of the service. After a minor portion of the service, there's a half Kaddish. It's a way of saying this part of the service came to an end and we're ready for another part of the service. Now, there's something deeper involved over here. When we say our prayers, simply a prayer means you're asking God for things, you're praising God, you're asking Him. But it's also a ladder. When Jacob, the patriarch, falls asleep and he has a dream, in a dream he sees a ladder going from the ground to the heavens, and the angels are going up and down. What exactly was that dream? It had many meanings, but one of the meanings, the Zohar says, is it's the symbol of prayer. Prayer, you say when you're on the ground, when you're on the lowest plane possible. That's why Jewish law says that the cantor should not be on a platform, which they do in many temples. That's wrong. The cantor should be on the ground, and even where possible, lower than everyone else, because you cry out from the depths, King David says in Psalms. But also spiritually, prayer is where you're on the ground, literally and spiritually, you're on the lowest possible level. You recognize all your deficiencies, all your lowliness. Every one of us has their points that we're not proud of. And you come to God and you say, God, I want you to raise me up. And every part of the prayer, you're raised another level. So to indicate that one level has ended and another level is about to begin, we say the Kaddish. The Kaddish is what transports us from one level to another level, to a higher level. That's the half Kaddish, where it's a minor part of the prayer. Then there's the full Kaddish, complete Kaddish, when it's major parts of the service. And in that prayer we say, asking God to accept our prayers. In other words, this is a Jewish idea that you can pray that your prayers were accepted. That's what the full Kaddish, the complete Kaddish. Then there's the Rabbi's Kaddish, or the Rabbinical Kaddish. At the end of a study of rabbinic literature, where you ask God for the well-being of the Torah students and for all of Israel in the hope that they may devote themselves to the sacred tasks. So this is a Kaddish that was said when people would study Torah, especially the oral Torah, specifically the oral Torah, the Talmud, and after they would finish studying, they would say this Kaddish. And then there's the burial Kaddish, the Kaddish that is said at a funeral. Unfortunately, most people don't know this Kaddish and don't say it, but it's a much longer Kaddish than what people say at funerals. And it's a Kaddish in which we actually refer to the resurrection of the dead and the restoration of the temple. And then the fifth Kaddish is the mourner's Kaddish, which is recited for the first year after the burial, and is said again on the yahrzeit, on the anniversary. And we do it for a year, but that year turns into 11 months, which we'll explain a little bit later. So you have the Kaddish on page 7 and the translation on page 8. And if you read the translation, it's all about praising God. Exalted and hallowed be His great name. May His name be blessed forever and to all eternity. That's the main part of the Kaddish, that phrase, that one verse. May His great name be blessed forever and to all eternity. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevarach Le'olam L'Olam Yomaya. So what exactly is Kaddish? So it's many things, and we'll go through a few of them. Number one, it's a vigorous declaration of faith. The echo of Job. Job was tested by God, subjected to terrible pain and suffering, the loss of his children, loss of his wealth, and he was in the depths in the dumps. And what does Job say? Though he slay me, yet I will trust in him. The same thing is true when a person loses. This is for the mourner's Kaddish. When a person loses a loved one, they're in the depths. They're in terrible pain. There's grief and sadness. And in a time like that, a person tends to want to forget about everything important because they're wallowing in their grief. And at a time like that, we say we didn't lose our trust in God. So we exalt God's name and praise him despite the realization that he had just wrenched a human being from life. That's one aspect of the Kaddish, that in spite of the fact that it's human nature to lose faith at a time like this, when you just lost someone who's so precious to you, you say to God, God, I haven't lost my trust in you. There's a famous story of someone who went through terrible suffering and pain, lost a family, and they were tortured and this and that, and they said, God, I know you're testing me. No matter what you'll do to me, I will never lose my faith. And we saw this with Holocaust survivors. Holocaust survivors, many of them, you expected for them to lose their faith, and many did. But I discovered that that's not really the common response to the Holocaust. I used to teach a course at UB on the Holocaust, and one of the projects that they were graded on was they had to do a interview with Holocaust survivors, and the interview had to focus on what was their level of faith and observance of Judaism before the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, and after the Holocaust. And I expected to get 90% of them to say, I lost my faith, period. I have about 200 interviews. Of the 200, 197, 198, let me put it the other way around. 2 or 3 of them were people who said, I lost my faith and I never regained it. The other 197 or 98, I don't remember exactly, all said either, I never lost my faith, I lost my faith but I got it back completely, I lost my faith but I got it back partially, and some people said, I got more faith because of the Holocaust. Only 2 or 3 who said that they lost their faith, period. And this was a shock to me and a surprise to me, because when I was growing up as a teenager, we used to go to visit different stores in the Lower East Side to ask the Jewish vendors to put on tefillin. And we got a lot of flack. They were so angry and saying, how dare you ask us to put on tefillin? We don't believe in anything. And we were children essentially, and we tried to explain to them why the Holocaust happened, and that made them even angrier. I realized how foolish that was, and so theologically untenable. So in my mind, when I started teaching at UB, I realized I'm sure that I'm going to get a lot of negativity, and I got the opposite. Because the people were angry, but to be angry at God, you have to be a very solid believer in God. You can't be angry at nothing. An atheist has standing alone, and